Everybody, welcome back to the channel. If you're tuning in on the podcast version of the show, well, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm your host, Badr Milligan, and I've got the amazing, incredible, big brain Blythe Blythe with me as well. What up, Blythe?
Hey, how's it going?
How's everything going? Anything new in the podcast world for you?
No, today is first time we are recording in a few weeks. I had to twist your arm in order to get you to record because we are committed to this show. So we have to show up with our experience.
Spoken like someone that doesn't have to edit and do that part of the podcasting.
You don't have to edit. And I think that is the lesson for a lot of podcasters, that if you want to be anal about something, that is your own choice. And you have made that choice. We have access to people that can help us edit for a very affordable rate. But that is something that you have chosen to take up and you are passionate about. So I'm going to let you run with that passion.
Today's topic was brought forth by you. You wanted to talk about how to promote your podcast episodes, interesting and creative ways. Outside of the box thinking, ways that we personally, strategies that we personally use to promote our podcast. And I thought this is a pretty good, this is like one of those, I think this is like one of those topics that we could do like multiple videos on, right? Like if we really wanted to break it down into like beginner, interim, and whatever pro level. Because I think this is definitely a topic that has no right or wrong answers. It really depends on, what your show's about, like who your audience is. And so I'm curious to see how you toss this one up.
Yeah, this is wanted to specifically talk about promoting your episodes within your current episodes, wherever your audience is finding your show. How are you promoting the next show that they listen to? And so that's the framework of thinking that I had when coming up with this topic, because honestly, it's something that I'm dealing with right now. It's something that I try to check on regularly, because or maybe most of us don't know that podcast discoverability is probably the biggest challenge in our industry, where you only really hear about a show from a friend through word of mouth, someone telling you, hey, you should really listen to this show. That was one of the bigger reasons why we started the directory that's on the website. But now that we have the directory, I'm starting to think of what are the ways that we can, it's not just enough to have all of the podcasts that are listed in the directory on the Jack's Podcasters United website. If you haven't, shameless plug, if you have not submitted your show there, it is free to do and it only benefits you. And so trying to think of ways, okay, how do we continue to foster this community and growing it in ways that make sense, not just for us, but also for the community in general. And one of the bigger topics is, okay, well, how do we continue to shine a spotlight on these podcasters? We've had a regular YouTube series that's been going out. So thankful to you for spearheading that. All of these interviews that we got recorded. And I say we, and I'm referring to Eric and Phil, Rita and Kenny, who are also members of the JPU, who helped coordinate this at our Podathon event back in December. And so we've been regularly publishing those episodes out, I believe one a week over the last couple of months. So that's been really cool to see those come to light. And we've gotten a really good response from the community for those. So now it's, started, the wheels have started turning for me and how we can continue to keep that momentum going after that series is done. And so that's where this topic came up, is how can we promote other episodes when someone is already listening to an episode? Now, obviously, we are in a unique situation where we had this community, we had this directory, but then on the flip side of things, what about you as a podcaster? How can you recommend other episodes? If you're lucky enough to get someone to notice your show, to press play on an episode, what are some ways that you can get them to listen to more episodes and binge your podcast? Because that's probably the number one way I listen to podcasts now, is just binging a bunch of them in a row. When I have household chores or tasks that I need to get done, I'll set up a queue in my Overcast app, and then I'll go through and I'll listen to all of them while I'm doing things. And I'll find that I will continue to do things around the house if I have that good playlist going. So how do you captivate, that audience that's already listening to you?
Yeah. I don't know what I was going to say to that. I have no response. There wasn't really a question or anything to that. I'm just going to piggyback off that. And I've got like my fair share of podcasts that's like routine listening. Like, one drops on Tuesday, Actually, both drop on Tuesday. I think one drops on Wednesday, and I'm I try to sparse it out to where I'm not finishing all three in like a day, so that way by the time the new episodes drop, I'm ready for that. And I guess for me, I've been such a loyal listener to those shows that they don't need to do any convincing. Like
Hmm.
they've got me locked in. I've been following them for years, and I think that's that kind of speaks to maybe the overall goal for a lot of podcasters is to build that committed listenership that they don't have to do a lot of work, like they're going to tune in every week to become like a part of someone's routine. I think is a goal that a lot of podcasters share. Like that's the ideal, right? Like you want to build routine listenerships.
I'm curious with those shows, are they all kind of news topical based?
They're mainly music interviews. And mainly one is primarily interviews, like one-on-one interviews. The other one is like just kind of topical conversations between two radio personalities slash DJs. And the other one is kind of like long form interviews as well. So I'm always like checking out for, hey, is this week's guest, speaks to me, or am I going to learn something new? And the other one is more like, oh, I really want to hear these guys' opinion on, the Kendrick Drake beef to be topical.
Well, I think that that's a good insight. And the reason I ask that is because I have certain shows that I listen to as soon as they drop because I know their schedule and I know that they're going to be talking about something topical. But then I have other shows like Hidden Brain, for example, is one of my favorite podcasts. But when they drop an episode, I add it to the queue because I know there's going to be a random Saturday or Sunday where I'm going to listen to 3 or 4 of those episodes all in a row. So there's kind of, sort of the notion around, who are your biggest fans of the podcast? If they listen within the first 7 days, they're typically your biggest fans. But I don't know that I find that to be all the way true unless you are a news podcast. Then I think if you're news related, if you're topical related, then there's much more incentive to listen right away,
Yeah.
or else the information becomes outdated. But then on the flip side, there are episodes, there are conversations that I listen to sometimes weeks or even months later that I'm listening to all of them in a row. Some of them are part of a series, so I just want to knock them all out at once in order. And so I really think it depends on the podcast, it depends on the show. But you're right, how do you get into that regular rotation that when you have an episode that has dropped, someone is clicking on play within that day of seeing it, or they're adding you to their normal habits, their normal, cleaning on Saturday morning, or you're like me, you're making ginger shots every other week. And so what are you listening to during that time frame of your regular chores that make it into the rotation, but also might not be topical?
I think, well, the first thing that comes to mind in a strategy that I've used for the last, several years is make it easy to where your listeners aren't guessing when a new episode drops. So like if it's within your power to have a set schedule on, for me, I release every Wednesday. People know on Wednesdays, new short box is going to drop. I also strategically pick that date because that is new comic book day. That's when all the new comic books hit comic shops. So, in my head, the ideal listener is someone that's visiting their comic shop on a Wednesday or, is kind of excited for that day. They're looking forward to like news and conversation about, what they should pick up. So, it kind of goes hand in hand. I'm trying to like ride the wave of the weekly holiday for comic nerds out there. So I think if you can pick a date and stick to it and make it a schedule, I think that's one less barrier for your listeners. Like they know, it becomes part of the routine. I know I've had the opportunity to talk to a few listeners where they're like, yeah, Wednesdays I start my day for your show. I hit the shop. I already know what I'm going to get,
That's cool. That's good insight to have, especially if you can coordinate it with a specific reason why. Like, what is the motivation to listen to this now? And I think that you covered it with your release or comic book release day of the week, which is like a motivator for a lot of people to listen. It's very similar to like a news topical show that you're gonna want to press play pretty quickly. And so how do you harvest in on that attention while you have it and just keep them there so that they can listen to the either not just press play, but press play on the next episode. And so I think that was the main topic for today is really, getting into what are some easy ways to make someone hit play on that next episode, but then maybe some more advanced ways. So I know that I have a handful of ones that I wrote down last night, and then I think that you have a couple as well.
I have a couple that I'm going to make up on the fly after I hear all the great ideas you've got, and I'm just going to piggyback off some of those. No, I've got a couple ideas. I didn't know that it was going to specifically be about the next episode, which I think adds some pretty cool nuance to this conversation. Because I mean, there's plenty of tips out there on how to promote your show, but thinking like the next show, how do you work that into a current show without losing focus and not feeling like kind of like, you're just always shamelessly plugging. I think the thought I had was like, well, how do you also promote old episodes? And I think I've got one or two tactics that I've tried that might be helpful too. Because especially if like you're a show that has evergreen content, it could be. You also want those episodes to get love and attention as well. But I'll address that when it's time. But how about you go ahead and cue us up? What are some of the things you got?
Okay, there? So the first one is these first couple ones are going to be very easy and almost like duh, like why wouldn't you do it? But for folks who are newer, who may not be as entrenched as we are in the podcasting space, but a host read ad. We have talked before at our podcaster meetups where they have mentioned that having another podcast, so say you have a sister podcast, let's use the Wait For It podcast for as an example here, because you go on regularly to their show. Phil and Eric have also been on the Short Box. And so if we could think about it in a sort of a next level, like sure, you're a guest on the show and that is, designed to drive awareness for your show, but to take it a step further, you could be reading an ad on your show for another podcast. So a host read ad about this other show that you may also like. And so you could work it out in a trade deal where that other show is doing the same exact thing. And you might think, well, why would I want to send my audience away? Why would I want to, that's technically a competitor. Why would I send traffic their way? But we're all about community over competition. We're all about, sort of that collaboration mindset. And if you have like-minded audience and you're friends with the people, then it makes perfect sense that you would want to promote each other, because the number one reason that someone is coming to listen to your show is because of you and your opinion and your perspective. That does not change just because you recommend another show. Now, it has to be a mutual benefiting, arrangement where the other host is doing the same for you. But a host read ad is one that I had at the top of the list.
And I guess add some colorful commentary there. You brought up, my guest appearances on, like the Phil and Eric show, and I've guested on other shows as well. I think that's one of the easiest ways to build, new listeners and to get yourself out there, because especially if it's a show that's similar to yours in topic. I go on other comic book podcasts, and when I was doing the music one, I was trying to, I was bringing other, music podcasts hosts on the show and vice versa. The beauty of podcasting is that a listener doesn't have to, they're not listening to just one podcast. They're not listening to just one sports podcast or, that is not a decision that, a listener has to make. They can enjoy as many podcasts as they want. So there isn't really a competition there in my eyes. That competition aspect is kind of arbitrary. I can understand if you're dealing with a very niche audience or something like that, but it's not like, people aren't making a decision of I'm either a Nike household or an Adidas household. It's podcasting. It's barrier to entry is low. That it's usually free. It's not costing them much. They can listen to as many as they want. And I think when you guest on other shows, especially if you could time it right? There are instances where I've gone on other shows and I'll plug in my next episode where, I try to tastefully insert hey, we're on this topic. Just want to let you guys know I've got an episode for that, obviously tastefully and, not dominating the conversation. But when you guest on other people's shows, you're going right there to your prime audience. I think at the end of the day, the base audience, ideal audience or listener that any podcaster wants is someone that listens to podcasts. And then obviously someone that's listening and has an interest in your field or, your topic. But guessing on other shows is an easy way of getting in front of an audience that's already halfway there.
And then I think once you have that guesting experience, that it only solidifies the relationship between you and that other show. And
For
so
sure.
that's a good opportunity to take it to that next level where you have a simple script that you're reading out on the show, or maybe it's a simple script that you record one time and you plug it into your show on a regular basis, where it's almost like a community spotlight or a podcast partner spotlight, where you have that ad break built into your show, so you're not interrupting sort of your other money making opportunities, but it is an ad slot that you can have pre-built into your show. And that's something that we've hammered home on a couple of our episodes already, is that if you're going to have a show, if you're going to start a show, build in those ad spots immediately or from the jump. Then that way it makes it much easier on you and your process if in the future you are to add on a paid sponsor. Then if you only have maybe 2 or 3 slots open per show for an ad, then maybe one of those ads is your podcast partners, the people that you work closely with. And then the other 2 spots are those paid spots. Or if you get the 3 spots, then unfortunately you have to make business decisions, but it could be a situation where you move that host read ad for that partner podcast, you move them into a monthly rotation instead of a weekly like there's a bunch of different options that you could take, but there's no harm whatsoever in partnering with other podcasts to promote each other's work. And then from the second point of view is building those ad slots already into your show so that it's kind of a plug and play depending on how well you're doing with podcast sponsorships and where those make the most sense in inserting them into your show.
Good point. All right, what else you got? What's next on your list?
All right, next one is very easy, and I probably should have started with this one. But your show notes. Your show notes are the biggest way that you could put front and center of exactly what you want your audience to know about that particular episode, but also what they could be listening to next after that episode is over. So in some of our show notes that we've done in the past, we'll have our typical show description, then we'll have the, links from this episode, but then we'll have a section where we say, listen to these shows next. And they are older episodes. They are ones that are relevant to the conversation that they're already listening to. Maybe it provides a little bit of a background. Maybe there's an interview with someone that provides a little bit more clarity for people who want to dive a little bit deeper into a particular topic of conversation. And so listening to these shows next, putting it within your show notes is already, you're making it easier on everyone involved, especially from the listener's perspective, because if they've already hit play on the episode, then they're going to be looking for what to play next after that episode. So if they can keep the train moving, then they're much more willing to make it so that it's similar. If you make it so that it's similar or relevant content to the person who is already listening to it, that's targeted marketing right there. And so that's a very easy thing for all podcasters to implement, is to think about what other, not just other episodes that you have, but what other relevant episodes that someone who is clicking play on that episode would probably enjoy next. And so thinking about it from that lens, I think would be a huge help for podcasters. Put yourself in your listener's perspective. That what would you want to listen to after hearing that show?
Good point. And I think the show notes area is such prime real estate to, include, CTAs, call to actions, and like you said, like links to other episodes. Like it's such a great opportunity and tool to like push anything you've got going on, whether it be a Patreon or informing people of, some other things that you've got going on. I think the show notes is sometimes untapped. For a lot of folks, I think all listeners or podcasters would benefit from really thinking about how to maximize these show notes and using that in a way to where maybe it helps with the actual content of your episode, right? Like, I know for me personally, when I first started out, it always felt like I needed to say everything on the podcast. Hey, make sure you're subscribed here. We got this going on this date. We also partner up with this. Like that's a lot to take in audio wise. And sometimes the listener just, exactly. Sometimes the listener just wants to get right to the meat of the show. And I think these show notes is where you can, if leveraged right, it saves you a lot of breathing room on the show to let the show breathe, let the content breathe, the interview breathe, and save all of that extra stuff for the show notes.
Yeah, for sure. Agree wholeheartedly. Now, the next ones that I wanted to mention, did you want to talk about your older episode? I mean, that kind of falls in the similar vein of using your show notes to your advantage, but you did say something about promoting older episodes, which kind of is the same.
I think I'll save my tips for older episode promotion after you finish yours. I think let's focus on the new, and then we could look back.
Okay. So the next ones that I am going to mention are a little bit more advanced. I would say the ones that I've already mentioned are very entry level that any podcaster would be able to implement right away. This next one, though, is a section on if you have a website for your podcast. Well, let me take that back. Because I think that as I'm thinking through this, I think that there's a more creative way to do this and also kind of falls into entry level positioning. So if you host with Buzzsprout, which I imagine that a lot of our listeners do host with Buzzsprout, so they have a feature that you can tag episodes. And so they have an episode player that you can use, and you can embed that player on your site or really, anywhere on the web that allows for embedding. So if you have that player, it typically will have all of the last 5 episodes or all of your episodes released in chronological order. But then they have another option for a custom player. And not a lot of people I've seen use this to their advantage. But if you think about it from the lens of, and I'll use my example of one that we just did with this. So we regularly feature women in logistics. I host Everything is Logistics podcast. So we regularly feature women in prominent roles, leadership roles, and we have them on the show. Now, I want to regularly promote women in logistics. So what I do now, and what is part of my process now, is that if I have a woman on the show, then in the episode notes, and also shout out to Lindsay, she's my assistant, she helps me with this, so she's actually the one doing this, but she goes into the episodes and she tags them now, and she tags it as women in logistics. I can now go into Buzzsprout and I can take that embed code for that specific tag, and all of those episodes for women in logistics shows up in that player. No other episode shows up there unless I tag it. So now we have that embedded player on a landing page on the website that we are able to direct traffic to and send them to. So we're almost giving them a playlist that they can binge, that they can enjoy. And while on that landing page, I will link to each of those individual shows. So if someone wants to listen to a specific individual show, then they can just click on the link and get there much faster than looking through the list of episodes that's in the embed player. But from our experiments that we ran over the Christmas holidays is that people want to make, what I have found in my own data is that people want to make less decisions on what to press play on. So if you can make it as easy on the listener as possible, such as a tagged, you could do the same thing for your episodes. Say, Star Wars is probably a terrible example because you don't really talk about Star Wars all that much. But you could MCU type content, which is separate from comic book related content, kind of. But if people only wanted to listen to MCU movies that have been released, you could technically tag that in your episodes and create a master playlist for all of those episodes. And so you're just making it easier on your audience to discover the next show based on what they've already shown interest in. And so that's what the sort of the ethos of what the next level of upping our marketing game when it comes to the podcast is, how do we make it as stupid easy as possible to listen to the next episode? And using that custom player from Buzzsprout, now that we've seen a fair amount of success with it, because we were able to turn it into an email, we were able to turn it into social content, and so now we're creating regular campaigns where we send traffic back to that main landing page, and now it's just an extra part of our process that anytime we go and upload a new episode into Buzzsprout, if it's a woman that is being interviewed, then we tag it as women in logistics, and that sets up some future automation things, which I can get into in a little bit. But we have that main resource because that I don't have to reinstall the embed player onto the landing page, because the beauty of using Buzzsprout is once a new episode is added and tagged correctly, that custom player just lives on the site and is consistently updated. So it creates a resource landing page where we can send basically our best content. We are going to do this for other sort of content categories, but it's a way for me to be able to say, here is all of these episodes that you've shown it, or you've shown interest in one of these episodes. Here's the rest of the catalog that you can binge on a weekend. So that's sort of the mind frame or the mindset that I look at it. And there are tools that exist. I would imagine that these tools exist in other podcast hosting apps, but I know in Buzzsprout in particular, I'm now, because of the success of that Women in Logistics player, now we're going to go in and we're going to make, like an AI in logistics. We're going to make, I don't want to reveal too much just in case, competition is listening. We talked about being friendly competitors. I still don't want to release an idea until, I don't want to talk about an idea until I've actually released it and tested it myself.
Yeah, we're on to you, you moles, you logistic industry moles, trying to steal Blythe's great ideas.
Logistics has historically a somewhat shady business, but yeah, you have to.
On the topic of tags, that is something that I do feel. I'm kind of like it. You know what I like about Buzzsprout? There's a lot to like about Buzzsprout. Shameless plug. But what I do enjoy is that they that feature specifically, and it might just be the fact that I've OCD. I'm kind of completionist, that I will fill out everything in a form, and I always make sure to include tags for every episode. And I find it really works because my show isn't always interviews. Like, interviews now are a big part of it, but there are occasions where we're covering like weekly news, or we might do a movie review. So luckily, this is a habit that I've trained myself to do for a while now. So if I wanted to create a playlist for just our interviews, that I can easily compile all of those. Same thing with, comic news and movie reviews. So I think if you're a, podcaster that's starting out, I think this is a prime opportunity for you to build some habits going forward, and it's pretty easy too, right? Like, it's all part of the upload process. Like Blythe said, we're not quite sure how it works in other podcast hosts. I think it's probably similar. I know Buzzsprout, it's part of the whole upload thing, right? Like, it's right at the very bottom.
Well, you do have to click that extra button where
Sure.
It's like show more options. And
Yeah,
not,
and it shows-
not a lot of people, like my own assistant, she did not know that those extra options existed until I pointed that out to her. And so it was one of those situations where, as soon as she knows now she knows to go in and select those options and make sure that's happening.
Yeah, but I think to put a cherry on top of this, your point of kind of curating the content for your listeners, because if they're listening to one interview, Women in Logistics, they probably will like, another interview, or, just letting them know that, hey, here's some topics. I've already got you covered in episodes. I think once again, it's all about removing any barriers for your listeners, making it incredibly easy, capitalizing on their attention right there, right then, right? Like, not to sound mad shady, but like, that is, how YouTube does it, right? Like, that is their whole algorithm, keeping you on the platform, showing you the next video. And I think kind of borrowing some of that tactic for your own show, and maybe incorporating, your best episodes in a playlist would probably go a long way. What's next?
Yeah. Well, great final point there, because I think, what we are kind of talking about is more like content specific, whereas a regular sort of everyday podcaster that's kind of just getting started or just trying to think about ways to up their game, just create a best of playlist where your favorite episodes, it could be, 3 to 5 episodes. And if it's your favorite ones, it's your favorite ones for a reason. And so you could use that as a catalyst to introduce your show to other people, instead of them just, hoping to stumble on an episode that you really like. Instead, you could have that ready to go. It's especially helpful if you have your own website. I know, which is a little bit of a higher barrier for other folks to reach, but you could still curate that playlist and just link to it, and then you have that link to that playlist instead of adding it to a website. So you could just keep that link going and keep it handy, keep it bookmarked, and then that way you're sending that out on a regular basis, where that's a regular sort of social media message that you send out. Hey, here is a list of our best of podcast, or it's always updated, that kind of terminology, where you could make it stupid easy for someone to get introduced to your podcast. And if you really enjoy those episodes, chances are that other people will too.
Well said. What else have you got on your list?
Okay. The next one is going to be a little bit more technical. So it requires a little bit more dev help. So if you have a website developer, one that can help you, I guess, take advantage of this, because this is one thing that we are taking advantage of right now and figuring out ways to do it. So we have a tool on our site where we collect information for everybody that signs up for the email newsletter. So we have an email newsletter that goes out for the podcast once a week. And based on where those readers signed up, so we use what's called a source URL. So typically on our website template, we have a post where the podcast is uploaded. So the podcast player is there. We have a version of the YouTube that's there, all of our show notes, and it all lives on our website. So below that, we have listen to these shows next, which is sort of automated, but it's very familiar. If you're on like a local news website, things like that, they typically will show you what to read next. Well, very similarly, we treat the podcast the same way. But also on that page, we have an email sign up. And it's a very simple, basic form. What's your name? What's your email? They sign up, and then I get the notification of the URL in which they signed up. So based on the types of content that I cover, so think about it from trucking, technology, warehousing, things like that, women in logistics, things like that. If I know the source URL of where they signed up, what that tells me is that someone arrived on that page and they clicked play on an episode and they really liked it and they signed up for the email. Or they got to that page and they didn't have time to click play, but they want to hear from me in the future. All great signs. However, when they sign up for it, I am getting that information of the link that they used to sign up for it. So then I can sort of deduce from the source URL of what other content that they would like to see in the future. So now we have probably 10 to 15 articles that get a massive amount of SEO traffic. For, SEO is another topic that for podcasters, I don't think you should waste a lot of your time on, especially in its current form, just because I maybe a future episode we can speak on that, because there's a lot of fluctuations going on in the search engine world and how that affects just content in general online. However, if we get that sort of information coming from 10 to 15 of our top articles are where 80% of our email subscribers are signing up. They're signing up for specific content. And when it comes to my audience, a lot of them are truck drivers and they're looking for ways to better their business. And the URLs that they're signing up for clearly tell me that they work in trucking. And so based on the parameters of where they signed up, I can now go inside of MailChimp and automatically tag anyone who signs up from that URL as trucking. And then from there, I can add them to what's called a journey inside of MailChimp, where if that person signs up from this URL, they're going to get this series of emails. And that series of emails, which is what we're working on right now, it introduces that person to our podcast. So what is that first episode that they're going to listen to? What's the second one? And so we're developing an email campaign, an email journey based on that source URL of where that person signed up from. So that's something that I'm really excited about, because I feel very strongly that, we live in a world where, not very strongly, it's just a simple fact that we live in a world where attention is trying to get captured everywhere you look, whether it's in a real world environment or a digital environment. And so if you are lucky enough that someone arrived on your site and chose to still stay in touch with you, how do you sort of cultivate that relationship with them so that they turn into somebody that is listening on a weekly basis? And so that's sort of the mindset that I come from, that I think of. And so a lot of website form builders can do this, where they can document the URL in which someone signed up for. Now, if you notice some of these pages are more popular than the other, then that is a good signal for you to say, okay, we should do more shows on this topic. We should cover this more in depth. Maybe we should spruce up that landing page of that show that they're arriving on in order to encourage them to listen to other related shows. If we are lucky enough for them to take that next step and to sign up for our email newsletter, then that is what I want to send them on, a path that's sort of going to hold their hand until they get on sort of the normal, regular weekly email list of these are the new episodes that are dropping this week. So it's more of like a customized hand-holding experience based on where that person first discovered the podcast, where they signed up for our email, and then how we're going to hold their hand through introducing our show to them so that we become a regular habit that's built into their weekly listening or their monthly listening.
Wow. When you said that this was going to be for the pro level podcast, I was like, how difficult could it be? Yeah, that is definitely a pro level tip right there. Good food for thought, and it's got me thinking about ways I can probably spruce up the old Shortbox website.
We have all of that stuff on your site too. It's just a matter of, thinking about it from the listener perspective.
More work. I got it. All right. I think, did you go through your list?
Yeah, that was that's pretty much it for, I think, the Buzzsprout player and tags, I think, is probably going to be the biggest takeaway for a lot of folks here, because it really is the simplest way to compile a best of. And then if you get to the point where you do have a website, you can start thinking about these different ways of how you can enhance the visitor experience, because it's only going to become more of a battle for attention in people's email inboxes, on social media, and things like that. And if you can make it as easy as possible, make it stupid easy for your audience to engage with your content, because they are being disrupted by so many different things that want their attention. So if you can make it as easy as possible on them to enjoy your content, then that is a much better way to build a sustainable podcast that grows in value over time, because you're putting the listener and the audience first.
Well said. And I'll double down on the show notes aspect too. Like I said, I think that is prime real estate to help you get call to actions done, support in different ways. So my list is vastly shorter, and it'll focus on pushing and promoting older episodes. And maybe this first one is maybe more so for someone that's been doing it for a couple of years, that has a back catalog that they can leverage. And that is something that I've started doing as someone that's been podding for 12 plus years. Is I've got obviously a lot of back episodes, a giant catalog of episodes. And I actually got this strategy from one of my favorite podcasts called the Questlove Supreme podcast. They've been doing it since, I think, 2018, 2017, somewhere around that time frame. And on Tuesday, their new episodes drop on Wednesday. But on Tuesday, they release a Questlove Supreme Classic, or they call it QLS Classic episode. And they just release an old interview, and they actually break their interviews up into parts. So, 1 week it's part one of this classic interview, and then the next, Wednesday they drop the new one. And it got me thinking, like, man, I started running into a wall where I was like, man, I just need time to edit episodes, batch record, and get these scheduled. So I started leveraging that same tactic too, where on weeks where maybe I don't have an interview ready yet, or I've got interviews scheduled but not recorded, I've started to incorporate short box classic episodes where I drop an old episode. I try to find the most evergreen content I can. And I think that is one thing that, maybe the strategy more so works for, podcasters that are covering evergreen content that aren't reliant on weekly news. I think interviews can fall into evergreen content as well, I think that they fit as well. So I think that is one way of getting people reintroduced to older content, to take advantage of your existing episodes on weeks that maybe you need a break, or you just want to go ahead and promote something that's maybe relevant or topical. And I think this strategy really works when you consider that it's difficult to tell as a podcaster whether your downloads for the week or the month are coming from existing, recurring, the same listeners or someone new. I always edge on the side of safety and caution that this could be someone's first time tuning in. Unless I'm getting an email or some sort of communication, I just assume that everyone listening might be someone new. And when you consider that, I think that's where the power of re-releasing certain episodes and evergreen content works. Because now you're showing your potential new listeners. I think there's a little bit of like a confidence factor that, oh, this guy's been doing it for a while. He can drop classic episodes or older episodes. You're also maybe reintroducing an episode to a new listener that probably wouldn't have gone back to that particular episode. I've started dropping like interviews that I really liked from the past, cleaning them up. I'll do a little bit of editing because just the sound quality isn't up to par with where I'm at now. So just being smart about your content and different, how you can maximize them. I think with a lot of podcasters, and I know, personally speaking for myself, that it's easy to fall into the rat race of like, all right, next week, next episode, tune in, what's the next thing? And then you kind of like look back and, you've amassed a lot of episodes, but, I think a lot of podcasters see that as like disposable. It's like, all right, well, that's old, out of sight. And that's not really the case. And, unfortunately, it took me up until now to realize, there's evergreen content there. There is more potential for it to be out there and repurpose. So if you have a back catalog that's significant, or you feel like you've got an episode that maybe just didn't, pop off like you wanted it to, or, it's a personal favorite of yours that you want more people to know about, I think leveraging that strategy of re-releasing certain episodes to vitalize them, could be a good strategy of getting people to check out older episodes and push older episodes. Have you ever tried that?
So I do something. So I've only done it in a bind when so typically in my world, it's very, very challenging to interview someone in the month of December and also the month of like July and August. Why? Because most people are not in the office. They've got a lot of commitments. They're taking vacations. Those are particularly really challenging times to have interviews. And so what I have done is just re-release the episode. But there is something, and I'll mention that in just a minute, but I am curious, do you go in and create another intro for those episodes, for those reposts?
No, and I was just about to say, I think one of the downfalls or obstacles that you have to keep in mind is there could be a confusion factor for a dedicated, weekly listener that's like, wait a minute. I actually, a great example is I had re-released an episode and I had someone message me like, oh man, it's great to hear, your co-host back on the show. And I had to, clarify like, oh, no, this is an old episode that I dropped. I thought maybe that was something that would have easily been picked up on, but I can totally understand the confusion. All I had relied on was the episode title saying Short Box Classic, XYZ. And in the show notes, I'll write very first thing in bold. This episode was originally released as episode 125 in October 2000 or something. Well, not 2000, but you know what I mean, 2010 or something like that. I probably will, going forward, record a short intro just to give some context. I think that'll probably be a lot more helpful and go a long way than just assuming that someone knows, oh, this is an old episode.
Yeah, I would definitely think that would help a ton, because I've seen other podcasters just write out the words repost in their in the episode title, but I don't know that that's enough, because sometimes it really depends on also the podcast player of wherever you're looking at the show, because it could cut off, that piece at the end, especially if you have really wordy titles. Then if you're putting repost at the end, somebody may not know that, even though they clicked on it and even though they saw the first part of the title. So I think that the intro, just a quick like 20-30 seconds, hey guys, this is the show that I think you're still going to really like it. It's still really timely. This is, XY reasons. And if they keep listening, then great. One area that we have experimented with over the last couple of years, especially in the month of December, is we will release super episodes. So taking the 4 or 5 best episodes within a particular category, and then we'll upload those, we'll edit those, I'll create an intro for that super episode, and then have some kind of a sound break in between each episode, or create a separate intro for each one of them. Meaning, if we well, I'll go back to women in logistics. Let me use another example. Creators in logistics. So there's been sort of this explosion of people who are making podcasts and YouTube videos within our space. And so I interviewed about a half a dozen of them over the course of last year. And so in December, I'm looking for episodes to publish because I already know I'm going to be busy. Potential guests are going to be busy. So let's just take some time off and enjoy family time and enjoy the downtime and instead create these super episodes. So it takes a little bit more work on the front end, but it allowed me to take all of December off from podcast hosting and then half of January off because we had so many episodes and people loved them because we took these, it's sort of like a best of compilation where we took, the best creators in logistics. Here are those interviews. I think you guys are going to really like them, yada, yada, yada. And then we played the first interview. Then I set up the next interview very, very briefly. So I'm not doing, a couple interviews or a couple intros for each additional show, which adds up to be like, a dozen. If we're 6 episodes and I'd be doing a dozen intros and nobody has time for that. So it's kind of like a case by case basis, but the audience really responded to them. All of them got just as much, if not more downloads than a typical episode. And so that sort of feeds into my theory that people are looking to make less decisions and that if you can have a topic that they're already interested in, just make it easy for them to listen to the next episode. And so that could be with your older episode reposting strategy, that could be another area that you explore. Just know that you cannot upload over a certain file size. I found that out the hard way, which is originally why we came up with the Women in Logistics playlist, is because I tried to upload like a 9-hour episode to Buzzsprout and it didn't work. So just keep that in mind.
Good food for thought. All right, and the last tip I have in terms of repurposing older episodes, or actually this was a tip for promoting new episodes. So I apologize. I just wanted to highlight repurposing your older episodes, and really, I guess the point I'm trying to get across with the whole Short Box Classic stuff and advice is that to not look at your content in your episodes as disposable. Right? Like it doesn't have to, just be out of sight, out of mind after you release it. I think coming up with a strategy and a structure or a vehicle to re-release certain episodes and putting spotlights on those, goes a long way in terms of reintroducing your content to new listeners, highlighting, important episodes or ones that you feel proud of. And once again, like I think there is maybe and maybe I'm looking too deep into this, but I think there's a little bit of a psychological confidence thing there where, you're able to say, hey, this is a classic episode, something that you deem that way. I think there's a little bit of something to that. Because, when I see these QLS classic episodes, for me, it's like, oh, dang, I didn't listen to this. And there's, as a listener, I'm always looking for the next thing. And sometimes it's nice to be reminded, oh, I didn't jump into this since day one, episode 1. So there's definitely episodes I missed out on or interviews I skipped over. So something just keep in mind if you're someone that's been podcasting for a while that has the library of episodes to do that. To go back to the earlier conversation about promoting new episodes, I will say when I was recording an outro for every episode, I would mention in the outro, hey, and it really depended if I already had all my ducks in a row and I had, I was ahead a little bit. In the intro, I would say, hey, tune in next week when I've got so-and-so on the podcast. They do this, they do that. I think to do that, though, you've got to really be on your game in terms of scheduling, knowing what episodes you're putting out. And maybe if we haven't already talked about content planning, maybe that's something we'll discuss later on. But, mentioning it at the intro, I think targets exactly who you want, right? Like if someone is staying to the intro, to me, that tells me that, outro. Okay, the outro, thank you. If someone is saying to the intro, then bouncing. But if someone is saying in the outro, that tells me that like, that is the type of listener you want. Someone that's there all the way through, that's, tuned in, locked into the content, that's entertained by it, that finds it fascinating, using that space to promote the future episodes. It keeps it in their head, right? Like, because they're probably thinking too, like, all right, well, what am I doing next? And I think having that space, I think the outro, much like the show notes, is prime real estate to also get your, your shameless plugs out the way and your next steps and what you got going on as well. I tried also in the intro too, where I'll set up the current episode and I'll say, hey, and make sure you guys come back, looking in the future, next week I've got so-and-so if you're interested, I'll tell you more in the outro, but today's episode is blah, blah, blah. I think if you know and if you plan ahead, you can work it into, your intro, outros. And maybe, I guess, something I just thought about is if you've got it planned out like that, I mean, why not record a little bumper or something? If you like this episode, check out next week's episode. Here's a little preview. I think that's going to require a little more work, a little more advanced editing. But I'll just stop here and just say the outro. Consider using that as a way to promote, your next episode as well.
Yeah. Well, I think if you're going through, I can't really do that on my episodes just because of the way that we plan these. Our content is much more evergreen, but we also plan far in advance. So I can't really, and schedule changes just depending on what's going on in the market. So I'm trying to be timely with certain episodes. So if I were to do that strategy, I would almost take that to social as well. And so taking it to social, then it could be a situation where it's like, oh, I just got done with this interview. I can't wait for y'all to hear it. Here's what, I learned X, Y, Z. So you're kind of like teasing it before it. You're almost like a trailer of an upcoming episode that you can kind of think about it from that lens. So it's a little bit less work on the editing side of things. But if you can fit it into your workflow of your current episodes and it works for you, then I think that that's a no-brainer. But maybe if you can't, because of the way that you structure your show, there's other ways that you could tease out future episodes by using social media instead.
Yeah, and I just thought about another tactic for old episodes, promoting those, and it kind of goes back to the show notes thing as well. And I guess, having a website and, the way at least my site is set up, every episode is basically a blog post. When I write out my show notes, if I feel like there is... if there's an episode I can call back to, I just hyperlink it. Like always, I am a fan of hyperlinking. And I think with Buzzsprout's upload process, they make it really easy. And the fact that now all podcast players, I think safe to say all podcast players will actually use the hyperlinks and allow those, like Spotify. I think Apple Podcasts just rolled that out a couple months ago. Why not? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. It's like it doesn't hurt it. I mean, all it does is just change the text bright white and underline. Like if you can connect, if it makes sense to connect something in that show note to an older episode, I mean, why not? Whenever I type them out, if there's a topic or something relevant that I know I've got an episode in the tuck, why not go ahead and hyperlink it? So once again, it kind of goes back to the show notes thing of like, that is prime real estate to, maneuver and incorporate, old episodes, upcoming episodes, Patreon call to action and all that.
Yeah. Well said.
Thank you so much. And one more thing too. I did this a lot more in the early years of the podcast, but I would number my episodes. That was the first thing that was in the show notes was episode 246 or 250, and I would reference those episodes by number in the show. And in the podcast, in the comic book world, that makes a lot of sense because we always reference issue numbers anyway. Hey, issue 7 of X-Men had this and blah, blah, blah. So it kind of made sense to the culture of comic books and podcasting, where if you're labeling your episodes, there's just an easier way of referencing it. There's a lot less guessing game. I don't do that anymore now. I don't really know why I switched the strategy up. I think I started reading that, I got into the mindset that might be maybe confusing or intimidating to someone that's trying to jump in. They might see like, oh, damn, episode 300. I don't know if I want to jump into this. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I could see that.
Yeah. So I guess, weigh that with your show and if that makes a lot of sense. But when I first started out, I was numbering all of my episodes. And if we brought up something relevant, I could say, oh, by the way, we did talk about that. That was in episode 250. Check that out if you're interested in that.
Another thing to keep in mind, though, is as we're kind of talking about the real estate angle, you only have a certain amount of characters that are going to show up in that show title. So I see shows that make this mistake all the time where they will write out the full word episode and then they'll have the number And that is taking up so much real estate in your topic where you can't even, you can, what do you have left? Do you have maybe like 5 words that you can put into the title to get somebody to click on it? So that's the biggest reason. Because I used to do the same when I first launched the Everything is Logistics podcast. I think our first 10 episodes have the number in it. But now I don't do it at all because I know how valuable that real estate is. And if someone just sees a bunch of numbers, they're less likely to click on it because they're less likely to see that intro text. So their eyes are just going to keep moving down in that feed to the another show, another episode. And if I am lucky enough to earn that attention, I want to be able to give that whatever that person is looking for. I want them to be able to see it right away. If they click play on a certain topic, I want them to be able to hear that topic right away. So I'm trying to optimize for time because I know that time and attention is so limited in these digital worlds.
Well said. And I think we're probably nearing the end of this episode, but is there anything else that you want to add before I give the summation and recap?
You thought this was going to be a 15-minute episode.
Foolish of me. Foolish of me. 2 podcasters thinking they could get all the advice they want in 15 minutes. But I'm glad we spent a little bit of extra time. I think we've given a lot of great tips that a beginner, new podcaster could incorporate. And then obviously you've given some super pro level website builder
It's not that expensive. You
advice.
Just have to think about the journey.
Yes. So I think in summation, the big key points you can take away from this episode is utilizing the show notes. Treat your content, as evergreen as much as possible. Be open to repurposing content and older episodes, keeping in mind, this might be someone's first time. What else we got? Show notes, repurposing,
tagging your episodes. If your
tagging
podcast host
your episodes,
not prevents it, but does it?
Allows it. Yeah. Thinking. Oh, actually, yeah. So I think you could round that up into thinking of your best episodes, keeping that in mind, where at any point if someone should ask you what episode should I listen to, what do you think is your best episode, I think having that in your back pocket in a way for someone to easily consume that, it just helps you out in the end.
Absolutely.
So with that said, you know what, Blythe, I'm gonna go ahead and thank you for, you're right, I was a little hesitant on getting back on the mics and recording, but I'm glad that you gave me the push. Because sure enough, got the ball rolling, and now I'm like, let's keep on talking podcasting. But anyways, for all of you out there, thanks so much for checking in and tuning in. If you haven't already hit subscribe on the YouTube, please do so. If you haven't hit subscribe on the podcast, please do so. Most importantly, we would really appreciate if we got any ratings and reviews. You guys know how this goes. It helps us out in the long term, helps us with discoverability and getting people to check out the show. So please do that small favor for us. We appreciate it. And come back next week for another episode.